Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I realize it is mandatory, but nonetheless, thanks. This morning, what I want us to do is I want us to talk a little bit about campus foundations and student movements, and to head off in that direction. I want to tell you a story of a dear friend of mine. A couple of years ago, when my wife and I moved to Massachusetts. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned that, but Bronwyn and I and our daughter Maria, we live in Boston, Massachusetts, and a few Boston fans. And it's a great city. It's the highest concentration of campuses in the world in that one city. So it's been a fantastic place for me to get to study some of the early history of these foundations and the student movements that have come out of them. And we've just moved into a house with a group of our friends. There's 3 couples. We all live together in a big old house, creating community and sharing and intentional meals and prayer and worship together. And beginning to, desiring to open up our house for students to be able to come and wrestle out some of what we were talking about yesterday, about how do you live that priestly calling in business and in science and technology and education, healthcare, etc. And at any rate, a couple of years ago, when we moved to Massachusetts, we moved to a place called Worcester initially. And Worcester is about an hour outside of Boston. And our landlord was this guy named Leon. Okay, and Leon just happens to be one of my favorite people in the world. And when we first moved into our flat, Leon and I were working on the apartment together. And what we were doing, we were changing the light sockets. The sort of power sockets in the house, and we were transferring them from these 2-prong to 3-prong sockets, okay, is all we were doing. We're doing it all over the house, and when we got the first one done, because it was a little complicated, I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but Leon did. When we got the first one done, without thinking it, I said to Leon, we got it completed, and I went, "Bob's your uncle," okay? Now, Bob's your uncle it's a British expression. And it's because I lived in England for a long time. It's a quirky history of how it came to be, and I'll explain that in a minute. But when I said Bob's your uncle, my landlord, Leon, who was just getting to know me, he looked up at me, all right, and just very confused as to why on earth I told him Bob was his uncle, you know? And Leon's got this very strong Bostonian accent, and so I began to explain to him, I'm like, well, Leon, it's this saying, and I just got used to it over in the UK, and it's just like if something goes well for you, if something goes right, you say, "Bob's your uncle." So after that, every couple of minutes when we get something fixed in the apartment, Leon would look up at me with a strong, like, Boston accent. He'd be like, "Trent, is Bob my uncle?" You know? And I was like, "Oh, yes, Leon, Bob is your uncle," you know? So this goes on, honestly, for about an hour. We're working in the apartment. Well, Leon has to leave to go and get a part for this one thing we want to fix in the flat. And while he's away, you know, we're doing other things. He gets back to the house, and we're fixing this last little thing in the apartment. And when it's fixed, Leon looks up at me. And I know he wants to say it, you know, but clearly he's forgotten what the saying is, okay? And instead he looks at me, and there's a moment of sort of confusion, and then he says, "Is Harry home?" And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Is Harry home?" And I'm like, "Yes," you know? And so from that day forward, man, it became for me like a mission to try to understand how on earth this saying, "Bob's your uncle," even came to be, so I could tell my landlord, Leon, etc., you know, to get this thing right. So I did a little bit of research on it, and as it turns out, how this came to be was in 1887, the British Prime Minister, this guy, Lord Robert Cecil, he appointed his nephew, this guy by the name of Arthur Balfour, as the Chief Secretary for Ireland. Well, apparently his nephew was not that qualified for the job, but he was appointed because he was the nephew of the British Prime Minister. And one day, when he was in conversation with the press, he referred to the British Prime Minister, Lord Robert, as Uncle Bob, okay? And the press, back in the 1800s, they thought it was so funny that he called the Prime Minister his Uncle Bob. It became this common saying that if something went well for you, you know, like say you got appointed into this high, powerful political position even though you didn't deserve it. Perhaps it was because Bob is your uncle, all right? And Bob's your uncle became this saying. all right, that basically was sort of say, if something goes well for you, if you're successful, bam, Bob's your uncle, all right? Now, the reason I'm telling you that story, because some of you are clearly going, thanks for the history, what is this about, all right? The reason I'm telling is that simple journey into history, it's been the journey I've been on with campuses, literally, in the last year or even more of that in my life, of trying to understand the origins, trying to understand the roots, how they came to be and why they're here, what their early traditions were, what their early mottos were, etc. And the earliest roots of collegiate life in America, at least, they go back to Harvard, okay? There's a collection of campuses that emerged. There were 9 officially chartered colleges before America gained its independence, okay? They're called the Colonial Colleges. There were 9 of them. And most of them, they're colleges that you're gonna know pretty well. And when you read their earliest mottos and their documents, it's stunning to see how that their foundations of these colleges, they were rooted in faith, all right? I've got some slides up here. There we go. I also have a pointer. Do you see that? Uh-huh. All right? Harvard, 1636, the first college in America, founded with this motto, truth and for Christ and the church. Truth and for Christ and the church. The college laws of Harvard, and that we can track back to at least 1642, these words, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. And therefore to lay Christ in the bottom is the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. And seeing the Lord giveth wisdom, let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of God, okay? Shortly after this, some other campuses begin to emerge, and after Harvard, you see places like Yale that come up in 1701, and like I mentioned yesterday, the seal of Yale, it has this open Bible, and then beneath it, the words light and truth. Princeton comes around in 1746, and it's in response to what God is doing through something known as the Great Awakening. Ministers transformed by the Great Awakening, they create this initiative called Princeton in Time, originally known as the College of New Jersey. I restore life to the dead, and under God's power, she flourishes. Columbia in 1754, quoting Psalm 36, verse 9, in thy light shall we see light. Brown in 1764, in God we hope. Dartmouth in 1769, I love this from Matthew 3, verse 3, a voice crying out in the wilderness. And what's so fascinating about these early mottos and this history is that these mottos, these foundations, they're not just true of colleges and universities that emerged in the U.S. in our early history. They're true of colleges and universities around the world. The University of Freiburg, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Someone correct me. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you sat on the front row. Okay? 1457, the truth will make you free. John 8:32. Even the University of Oxford, that its teaching history extends all the way back to at least 1096. Okay? The motto, Psalm 27, verse 1, the Lord is my light. The Lord is my light. And that's the oldest of the English-speaking universities in the world. And these sorts of foundations and faith accompany the emergence of colleges and universities right around the planet. And as it relates to what that means for you and me specifically here in the States, what we must remember is this, okay? Harvard, that first campus in America, is founded in 1636. Okay, that's 140 years before the founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. You know what that means? Let me just speak it to you, okay? What it means is this: the students of the United States have as much responsibility as the government of the United States or the business structures, okay, of the United States in determining the direction of society and culture. Let me just say it again, okay? You were here first. 140 years before America gained its independence. This experiment, colleges and universities, was at work. And you have as much responsibility as the government structures and as the business structures and as all of these other social structures in determining the direction of culture and society. These roots must be remembered if we want to embrace the original and God-given design of campuses from the beginning. Now, what that doesn't mean is this, okay? I'm not talking about some sort of Puritan, 17th century Puritan religious uprising, all right, to take the campuses of America back for God. All right, I hear language like that sometimes, and to be honest with you, it freaks me out a little, all right? It's more terrifying to me than it is inspiring. This idea of, like a militant posse of 17th century Puritan ministers with like a musket and a Bible coming onto our campuses, we're here to take these back for God, all right? That terrifies me. It doesn't inspire me, all right? Because that's not how the kingdom works. The kingdom doesn't work in that way of saying we're going to get elected to this position or we're going to do this, and from the top down we're going to try to transform society. The kingdom ultimately works by a grassroots movement of people like you and me who begin to create some sacred space on these campuses again to engage with God. It's that simple. It's that simple. And that's what I'm talking about when I refer to the idea of us returning to our roots. Now, there is a remarkable and too often untold story in the history of colleges and universities. A story of faith and education, holy rebellion, and student prayer that reminds these campuses and reminds colleges and universities as a whole of why we are here in the first place. And I want us to consider some of those stories and movements in the few minutes we got here together this morning, okay? I'm just going to tell you a few stories from this time, and I want to pull out a few principles along the way that I hope will be models for understanding of how we go about doing what we're called to do during this time of our lives. Okay, and the first thing I want to tell you about is at the end of the 1700s, the early 1800s, it was a very volatile time in this country. We had just come through the American Revolution. Authority in general was increasingly suspect. You really felt that revolutionary spirit on campuses. And as a result, a lot of these campuses that had deep Christian roots, like those models we looked at, they began to buck against some of those authority structures that were in place. And when you study the history during this time, you see these sort of riots that begin to break out on campus. I tell this story in this book I just finished writing recently of this riot that breaks out at Princeton, okay, in 1814. And you want to talk about a prank that actually sets a campus aflame? Okay, these students got so upset with what was going on at Princeton, so angry against the authority structure, that one of the students took a hollowed out log, okay, filled it with 2 pounds of gunpowder, okay, and then put it up against the college door and set it aflame, okay? And when that thing blew up, okay, it blew the college doors apart, shattered windows throughout the whole building, and propelled a piece of the log through the prayer room, okay, that was inside this building. Okay? They were seriously upset with what was going on. Okay? They were seriously wrestling with some of the structures that were in place. Okay, and these riots would break out. But in response to that, there were some underground student movements that began to emerge, okay? And it's very interesting because at that time, Christianity was becoming increasingly suspect because it was sort of tied in at times with some of the authority structures that people were struggling with. These underground movements on campus, they begin to meet in secret, believers who would get together. Sometimes they would even have their meeting notes in code, okay, like a code language, so the other students wouldn't know what they were meeting about because they were so afraid if these students who were blowing up campus doors and college doors and stuff found out that they were Christians. Okay, and let me tell you some of the names of these groups that emerged in the early 1800s, okay? They're classic names, all right? The Theological Society of Dartmouth, the Yale Moral Society, the College Praying Society of Brown, and this next group, which is clearly the group with the hippest name of them all, okay? The Saturday Evening Religious Society at Harvard. Okay? I mean, imagine that. What are you doing tonight? Oh, I don't know. What are you doing? Well, I'm going to the Saturday Evening Religious Society, Woo! All right? Now, as mental as these names are, what they represented was this intentional re-engagement from students with the Christian roots of their universities and their colleges. And one of those groups that emerged out at Williams College in 1806, they were known as the Society of the Brethren. And some of you may know some of the history that came from that. This small group of students, there were 5 of them one day in a prayer meeting. They decided that they went outside and they were praying about different places around the world. And at that time, the idea of going to serve somewhere else in the world was, it was such an out there foreign concept. They could hardly imagine what it would really be like. And that day specifically in 1806, they were praying about China. And this one guy who was in the middle of that meeting, Samuel Williams, something inside of him kind of snapped, and he looked to his friends in the meeting, and this is what he said to them. I love it, okay? Sam Williams said, "We can do this if we will. Not we'll do this if we can." But when they were dreaming about what their studies could mean in the nations, Sam Williams said to his friends, "We can do this if we will." And it was out of that little group that emerged during that very volatile time of campus history, the American Foreign Missions Movement emerged. You trace it back to a group of praying students at Williams College in 1806. Now what struck me as I studied into this history is this. The interesting aspect of their lives and what it meant for them to follow Jesus was simply this. They were intentional. They were intentional about following Jesus and looking up and out to the rest of the world. They had decided they weren't going to simply float through their college careers and sort of follow the vibe of what everyone else was doing. They became intentional about following Jesus and determining what that would mean for them. They got together with their friends, they prayed together, and they intentionally engaged with the needs of the world, okay? Out of that little movement, you fast forward a number of years later, from 1806, you jump into a period of time, 1886. Now, the reason this date is significant in campus history, there's a couple of reasons why, okay? In 1886, mandatory chapel at Harvard University stopped. Mandatory chapel. After 250 years of mandatory chapel, okay, it stopped in 1886. Now, at the same time in 1886, a voluntary, not mandatory, a voluntary sort of Bible conference came together, a place called Mount Hermon. Okay? And out of that 251 college students who came together, the Mount Hermon Bible Conference in Massachusetts, 100 of them, they basically gave their lives to the cause of what God wanted to do around the world. And they signed a pledge, and they say, we are going to do everything we can to engage ourselves with the needs of the world. Okay? They became known as the Mount Hermon 100. And given some passion, given some focus, given some discipline, over the next generation, that group of 100 who became known as the Student Volunteer Movement, they went from the Mount Hermon 100 to actually embracing more than 100,000 students who involved themselves in that movement. And 20,000 of those students around America actually wound up serving around the world and engaging with some of the most pressing needs of that time, the Student Volunteer Movement. Now, here's the point to remember, okay? The point to remember is this. They were voluntary. Now, that is hard for us to think about at a place like Wheaton, okay? Because I understand, like, that this morning it's mandatory. You know what I'm saying? It's hard to be voluntary when it's mandatory, all right? But the point is that even in places like this, okay, even in places like this where you have this sort of setup where 3 days a week you're coming into a chapel, and I think it is so right that you are, and that's a whole nother story in campus history that we could tell, all right? But even in places like this, God can come and move in great power if you come willing, and if you come humble, and if you come hungry. And let me speak with you frankly, okay? This morning, man, I was sitting over there praying next door, and I was just going, Lord, I don't know how to inspire these guys. I don't know how to stir you up, and I just decided I don't even want to, really. I trust that you are here because something inside of you wants to follow Jesus. I've got to trust that. And if you will follow that, if you will go after that, and you'll stay humble and hungry in that, God will meet you in that. And he won't force himself on you. Now, as we get a little deeper into campus history, and I'll tell you one more story before we wrap up here this morning. In 1970, again, it was a really volatile time in this country. 1968, actually, at Columbia University in New York, man, riots had broken out on the campus. And a number of buildings were taken over. Even the president's office had been commandeered by students, okay? And they just took over the campus, literally. They were so angry because of the Vietnam War and all sorts of things. They took over the president's office. It hit the press and everything else. And there were student riots right around the nation, okay? During that time, there was sort of a different response to the angst of the era at this little college in Kentucky called Asbury. And basically what the students did there, and some of you will know this simple history, they began something known as the Great Experiment. And 30 students, they basically got together and they decided, it was 6 students for 30 days. They decided for every day they were going to get together, read a little bit of the scriptures, talk about what it means, and pray together for 30 days. And they would very simply respond to what they read in the scriptures. It wasn't anything complicated or big. They called this initiative the Great Experiment. For 30 days they did that, and then after that, they invited the whole sort of campus into that initiative. And then something very unusual took place. God, in response to some of those prayers, and because what God had initiated in their hearts, one day in a mandatory chapel service like this, okay, God showed up. And I don't know how to explain what that means exactly. It just meant that a number of students got real with each other about what they were struggling with, about what was going on in their lives. They got real about what they hungered for in the world. And that chapel service went from something that was mandatory, and then it became something voluntary. And for the next 185 hours, that's a long chapel service, all right? That service continued as students just got real with God. And the story of that began to sort of circulate around the nation. And numbers of colleges and universities and seminaries began to get caught up in that same sort of movement as a mandatory chapel service became voluntary response to what God was doing because these students got authentic with God and authentic with one another. You see, one of the greatest myths, man, and most disempowering concepts of our collegiate years is this bogus idea that real life starts later. Let me just say it again. One of the most disempowering myths and bogus concepts of our collegiate years is that real life starts later. As if the daily decisions that deeply influence our friends, significantly shape our campuses, and regularly recenter our lives have no actual bearing in the real world. We have this idea that the real world is somewhere out there. It's somewhere in the future. We have this bizarre concept in our minds that eternity somehow starts later. Think about that for a second. We have an idea that eternity starts later. And it makes us look at places like this and insist on referring to it as a bubble, where it's not really the real world. And I understand that it feels like it's all, consuming right here. Trust me, I studied here too. I know the bubble, all right? But what I'm saying is this, is if you will engage with the right now, if you will realize that eternity does not start later, if you will realize, in fact, look around you right now, just look around you, okay? Look around you. Welcome to the real world, people. Welcome to the real world. This is where life happens right now. And if you're not acting on what you believe in the present, what's to say you will in the future? If you're not acting on what you believe in the present, what's to say you will in the future? I'm remembering, man, that magical moment in John chapter 11 when Lazarus has died and Martha comes to Jesus, Lazarus' sister, and Jesus says to her, "Do you believe that Lazarus will raise again?" And Martha talks about the future. Martha says, "Yeah, I believe that, in the future, in that day, Lazarus, my brother, will rise again." And then Jesus responds like this. He says, "Martha, I am the resurrection. I am. Martha, welcome to the real world. The next 5 minutes count." God is not as concerned with your past or with your future as he is with the next 5 minutes and what you do with it. That's the beauty of our God. That's the beauty of a God who is so present in all of these moments. As I studied these various student movements, I discovered this. There's not any magical formula for campus transformation and social change. There's not any magical formula. Okay, but I did discover that it always seemed to take place when a group of friends got together intentionally. They started to follow Jesus the best they knew how, voluntarily, and they increasingly became authentic with one another confessionally. Every one of them seems to somehow be connected to that. It's not a magic formula, but it always starts with a group of friends who get intentional, who get voluntary, and who get confessional. And may God give you the grace to go and do the same. All right? By the way, tonight, for those of you who, if you want to talk about this a little more, we're going to have a little question and answer time about 9 p.m. I think it's over in the Fisher basement, something like that. And we're just going to hang out a little bit, questions and answers, and maybe talk and pray some together. If you want to talk about this more, we can do that again. So let me just pray for you, and then you're dismissed after this, all right? Lord, thank you that, thank you that there is a bigger story that is at work in the world than just us and just this campus. And I pray, Lord, that you would give my brothers and sisters that simple grace, Lord, to be intentional, to be voluntary, Lord, to be confessional in their pursuit of you. And Lord, that they would go about it with hope and with joy. And I ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. You're dismissed. We'll see you tomorrow.